I want to start with the smell of pine trees, because that's what I think about when I think about Sidney. Not the police reports, not the missing persons flyers with his face staring back at me from lampposts I'd driven past 1,000 times. Not the silence of my phone on the nights I still reach for it, half expecting him to call. I think about pine trees. When Sidney was maybe 7 years old, he walked out of the house on a Saturday morning without telling anyone and disappeared into the woods at the edge of our neighborhood. I was inside, making breakfast. Renee was reading the newspaper. We didn't notice he was gone for almost 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I have replayed that number in my mind more times than I can count because later, much later, 40 minutes would seem like nothing at all compared to the time he would take from us. But that morning we panicked. I ran out into the street, calling his name. Renee drove the car up and down the road. I was already imagining the worst when Sidney walked out of the tree line at the end of the garden, covered in mud, holding a handful of wild mushrooms and a stone he thought was interesting. He was completely calm, a little annoyed that we were upset. Actually, he looked at us like we were the ones who had done something strange. I was just exploring, he said. He was 7 years old, and he said it with such absolute certainty. I was just exploring, as if there were nothing more natural in the world. As if the woods were his home, and the house was just a place he returned to occasionally out of politeness. That was Sidney. He grew up in Garl, a small town in the Dutch province of North Holland. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have lived on the same streets for generations, where the rhythm of life is slow and predictable, and for most people, entirely comfortable. For Sidney, I think it was suffocating, not in a dramatic way. He was never cruel or angry about it. He simply seemed to exist slightly to the side of everything, like a photograph that's been framed slightly off-center. You notice it, but you can't quite explain what's wrong. He was the oldest of our 3 children. Renee and I were young when we had him, maybe too young, though I don't say that as an excuse for anything. We loved him. We loved all of them. But Sidney was different from the beginning in ways I struggled to name. Quieter, more interior. He watched more than he participated. At birthday parties, he'd find a corner. At school events, I'd spot him standing just outside the main group of children, not sad exactly, just observing like an anthropologist studying a culture he found fascinating but didn't quite belong to. He didn't have many friends. The ones he had were never close. I used to worry about this when he was young, and then I stopped worrying because he never seemed to suffer from it. He didn't appear lonely. He appeared, if anything, relieved whenever social obligations ended and he could go back to his room, or his woods, or his maps. Yes, the maps. Sidney had a wall above his desk covered in maps. Physical maps, topographic maps, satellite printouts he'd assembled from the internet and taped together. He'd mark routes on them with colored pens, hiking trails, mountain passes, river systems. By the time he was 14, he had mapped every forest within cycling distance of our house and explored most of them alone. He kept journals too, detailed ones, recording what he'd seen, what he'd eaten, how long he'd walked, what the weather had done. I read those journals after he disappeared. I'm not sure I should have. They were private, clearly private. There was no lock, but the intimacy of them was its own kind of barrier. Reading them felt like walking through a room where someone had just been, where the air still held the shape of their presence. What struck me most was how peaceful they were. There was no anguish in them, no teenage misery, no rage at the world, just careful, detailed observations. Birds today, 2 sparrowhawks, 1 kingfisher. Ground soft after rain. Found a cave system behind the limestone outcrop, too narrow to enter fully, but possible with effort. Temperature dropped faster than expected after 6 p.m. Need better insulation for overnight stays. He was preparing. Looking back, he was always preparing. For what? I didn't fully understand until much later. Renee and I separated when Sidney was in his first year of secondary school. I won't go into the details because the details aren't the point. What matters is that we did it as gently as we could, that we remained on good terms, that we tried very hard to protect the children from whatever grief the adults were carrying. The younger, too, adjusted. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, and more perceptive. They understood that their parents were happier apart, and they adapted. Sidney was different. He didn't break down or act out. He didn't become difficult or distant with me. What happened was subtler and, in retrospect, more serious. He became quieter. The already thin membrane between him and the world grew thinner still. He withdrew further into himself, into the woods, into the maps. Renee took him in. Sidney chose to live with his father, which hurt me, though I understood it. He was 13, and he needed stability and routine, and Renee could provide that in a way I couldn't at the time. But I watched him through those years, through every dinner and holiday and weekend visit, and I watched the withdrawal deepen. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggered alarms. Just steadily, like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice until you're standing far from the water. He got into martial arts at 15. This gave me hope. He trained hard, genuinely hard, with a discipline that impressed his instructors. He got into climbing too, bouldering, then rock faces, then eventually practicing rappelling techniques in the local quarry. He was physically impressive. By the time he was 17, he was almost 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered, strong. People noticed him when he walked into a room. He didn't notice them back. His social media accounts were full of nature photographs. Lonely forest paths at dawn, frost on leaves, the particular gray-green light of a November sky over a Dutch field. They were beautiful, genuinely beautiful, and they were entirely impersonal. Not a single photo of a friend, not a birthday celebration or a party. Just landscapes and the occasional video of himself doing pull-ups on a tree branch or navigating a hillside in rain. He participated in online forums. Extreme tourism, wilderness survival, urban exploration, the communities of people who sought out derelict buildings and forgotten infrastructure in the wild margins of the civilized world. He corresponded with them seriously, shared information, asked questions. In those spaces, I think he felt less like a stranger. That word came up later in one of our last real conversations. Strange. I know I keep returning to the chronology, but this conversation matters enough to linger over. It was late 2016. He was 18. He'd been rejected by the military a few months earlier, a decision that devastated him in a way I had not anticipated. I had thought the military was a passing interest, something he'd pursue and then set aside, but he had organized his identity around it. He'd published videos of himself completing obstacle courses, doing one-arm pull-ups, demonstrating his fitness. He'd collected documents, filled in forms, shown up to every test and assessment with absolute seriousness. And then they turned him down. Medical and psychological screening. I don't know the specific reasons, and I've never been told them with any clarity. I only know what it did to him. He stopped training. He dropped the martial arts. He started leaving the house for days at a time with just a rucksack, sleeping bag, food, firelighters at the torch. He'd return dirty and quieter than before and go straight to his room. Renee and I talked about it, worried about it, but Sidney was an adult now, technically, and neither of us knew how to reach him. That last real conversation happened on a Sunday evening. I cooked dinner and Sidney was there, and we were alone in the kitchen after, and I tried to ask him how he was. I expected the usual deflection. Fine, I'm fine, but instead he looked at me for a moment, and then he said something I've turned over in my mind every day since. He said, "I've always felt like a foreigner, not in a country, in everything. Like there's a way everyone else knows how to be that I never got the instructions for." I didn't know what to say. I reached for him, and he let me put my hand on his arm, and then he looked away and the moment closed. I should have said more. I've had 8 years to think about what I should have said. He left in late October 2016. He didn't say goodbye. That wasn't unusual. He came and went, and his departures were rarely announced. He packed what he always packed. Rucksack, sleeping bag, warm layers, food, his documents and bank cards, his phone. A tarpaulin, a waterproof jacket, the kind of kit that suggested preparation, not impulse. For the first few days after he left, Renee reached him by phone. Short calls, short answers. He was okay. He was somewhere. He didn't want to say where. This too was familiar enough not to cause panic. And then the calls thinned out, became texts. And then, on the 11th of November, the last message arrived. "I won't be back for a long time, and I won't stay in the same place." That was all. No explanation, no destination, no promise. After that, nothing. I've thought about that message so many times it has ceased to feel like language and become instead a kind of object, a small hard thing I carry. I've analyzed every word. Won't be back. Not can't be back. Not don't know when I'll be back. A choice. A long time. He knew it would be long, which means he had planned for it. Won't stay in the same place. Deliberate movement, deliberate avoidance of being found. He didn't want to be found. Renee and I gave it time. We told ourselves he needed space, that he'd reach out when he was ready, that this was a phase, an extreme phase, yes, but Sidney had always operated at extremes. Weeks passed. By December, the fear had become something physical, a weight I carried in my chest that made it hard to breathe deeply. On the 15th of December, we filed the missing persons report. The investigation moved slowly, bureaucratically slowly. I understand that there are procedures, that a healthy adult male who has left of his own apparent volition is not the same category of case as a missing child. I understand this intellectually, but I remember sitting in a police station waiting room watching a clock while somewhere out there my son was, where? And the gap between my understanding and my feeling was vast and unbridgeable. They pieced together a trail. He'd withdrawn cash from a machine 50 kilometers from home the day after he left. He'd spent time in Groesbeek, near the German border, then rented a cabin at a campsite in Diver. Witnesses remembered him there, quiet, polite, solitary, declining all offers of company. He'd bought food from supermarket, instant noodles, canned goods. He'd paid cash. He'd worn a warm jacket, a beanie, a rucksack. He'd been seen on surveillance cameras. He looked healthy, unhurried, almost peaceful. And then they found a train ticket. He'd bought it in late October, before he'd even left home. A ticket to Alsace, in northeastern France, to the region around Colmar. He'd been planning this for months. The ticket was purchased, the destination researched, the route prepared, all while he was still living in his father's house, attending to the ordinary surface of daily life. By the time investigators followed the trail to France, the surveillance footage from the railway stations had already been deleted. Standard retention periods. He had slipped through the gap between his disappearance and our report, and by the time anyone was looking for him in the places he'd actually been, the evidence was gone. Altenberg, that's the name that changed everything for the investigators. That's the name that, when I first heard it, sent something cold through me that I couldn't explain and still can't entirely. L'Hôpital d'Altenberg, the Altenberg Psychiatric Hospital, an abandoned complex in the mountains near Colmar. Not just a building, but an entire site, a network of structures spread across a remote mountain pass, including underground tunnels, technical shafts, and vast cellars. It had been abandoned for decades. Local people called it La Clinique du Diable, the Devil's Clinic. Sidney had been researching it extensively in the months before his disappearance. The investigators found it in his browser history, in his forum posts, in the threads he'd followed on sites dedicated to urban exploration and extreme survival. He had read everything available about it. He had looked at maps of the surrounding terrain. He had, apparently, been planning to go there. The complex attracted a strange mixture of visitors: adventure tourists, photographers, urban explorers, people seeking the particular thrill of entering spaces that have been surrendered to decay. But also, the investigators told me, others, people at the margins, the homeless, the isolated, the deliberately invisible, people who sought refuge in the abandoned and the forgotten. A place, in other words, that might appeal to someone who wanted to disappear from the world without anyone asking questions. Search teams went there in January 2017. Gendarmes, mountain rescue units, dog handlers. They combed the buildings, the tunnels, the forests surrounding the complex. The dogs picked up trails in several locations, and then lost them. Sidney, if it was Sidney, had known how to move through terrain without leaving a traceable path. Of course he had. He'd been practicing his whole life. Nothing was found. No body, no belongings, no evidence of habitation beyond what could have been anyone. The Devil's Clinic swallowed the investigation and gave nothing back. I went there once, 2 years after he disappeared. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Renee tried to talk me out of it, but I needed to stand in the place to see with my own eyes what had drawn Sidney so far from us. It's in the mountains above Colmar, at the end of a logging road that deteriorates into a track barely passable by car. The buildings emerge from the trees gradually, as if the forest has been slowly digesting them. Walls reclaimed by ivy, roofs collapsed under years of snow, windows long since gone, their frames hosting birds and weather indiscriminately. There's something about the scale of it that surprises you. You expect a ruin. What you find is an entire abandoned world, room after room, corridor after corridor, the detritus of institutional life. Iron bed frames, porcelain sinks cracked and tilted, filing cabinets rusted permanently shut, a chapel with its pews still aligned toward an altar for which everything sacred has been removed. I stood in the middle of it and called his name. The mountain absorbed it. In 2018, the investigation took a turn I hadn't expected. A Dutch man, 60 years old, named Josby, was arrested. Not for Sidney. The connection to Sidney was never proven, but for a crime he had committed in 1998 against an 11-year-old boy. He had been a fugitive for nearly 2 decades. The evidence that finally caught him had been found in a cabin near the Altenberg hospital complex, in the same area where Sidney had been headed. Josby was a survivalist, someone who knew how to live off the land, who understood wild terrain, who could remain invisible in remote places for extended periods. The cabin belonged to a local tourism association for which he had worked. And in that cabin, investigators found DNA evidence linking him to his 1998 victim and leading to his arrest, his extradition, his eventual conviction, his 16-year sentence. When they told me about Josby, my first reaction was relief, the terrible, guilty relief of thinking there's an explanation. Because explanations, even the worst ones, are easier than mystery. Mystery requires you to hold every possibility open simultaneously, and that is exhausting in a way that I can only describe as a kind of permanent internal noise, a static that never fully quiets. But the connection to Sidney was never established. The investigators looked methodically and carefully. The cabin was on the path many visitors took to the hospital. Josby was known to have been in the area during the relevant period. But there was no evidence, no physical evidence, no witness account, nothing linking him to Sidney specifically. He denied knowing anything about my son. I don't know what to believe. I want to believe that Sidney is alive. I want to believe that he is somewhere out there, living in the margins of the world, eating berries and mushrooms and moving quietly through forests, having found the isolation he always sought. I want to believe that someday he will walk out of the trees with mud on his boots and look at me with that mildly annoyed expression and say, I was just exploring. But I also know that the world is full of predators. I know the young man who sought solitude and avoided contact and moved through remote places alone was vulnerable in ways he probably didn't fully appreciate. And I know that some answers, when they finally come, are not the ones you were hoping for. The body found on the Costa Brava in 2018. A young man washed up on the Spanish coast, wearing a gilet with stones in the pockets, the same age and build as Sidney. Held my breath for 3 weeks while the DNA results were processed. It wasn't him. The relief and the grief arrived at the same moment, and I couldn't separate them. 8 years, 8 winters, 8 Octobers, which is his birth month, which I feel in my body the way you feel weather changing, a particular pressure, a particular quality to the light. He will be 27 now. I try to imagine it, the way you imagine a tree you planted and then left. How tall would it be? What shape would the branches have taken? Would it be bearing fruit yet? But Sidney was never easy to project forward. He always seemed to exist outside of conventional trajectories, outside the architecture of, and then he went to university, and then he got a job, and then he met someone. Whatever his life was going to look like, it was going to look like something I couldn't have predicted. The searches continued for years. Renee and I coordinated with missing persons organizations across Europe. We followed leads in Germany, France, Spain, Belgium, a sighting in a park in Strasbourg, a report from a soup kitchen in Lyon, a man matching Sidney's description scene near a monastery in the Pyrenees. Every lead investigated, every lead exhausted, none of them Sidney. 2 years ago, we offered a reward, 10,000 euros for credible information about his whereabouts. The response was enormous. Hundreds of messages, many of them well-intentioned, some of them clearly opportunistic, none of them useful. The digital trail had gone cold the moment he boarded that train. No card activity, no social media, no forum participation. In a world saturated with data, where every credit card swipe and every Google search and every CCTV camera and every supermarket generates a record, Sidney had achieved what most people would consider impossible: genuine invisibility. There are 2 ways I've learned to hold this. The first is that it's evidence he's alive and intentional. Disappearing this completely in the modern world requires not just motivation, but skill, the kind of skill that Sidney had been quietly accumulating his entire life. The wilderness knowledge, the survival training, the ability to go weeks without speaking to another person. If he wanted to live off the grid, genuinely off the grid, in a way that left no trace, he had the capability to do it. And in that scenario, the silence isn't a tragedy. It's his answer, his final and complete answer to a world that never felt like it was meant for him. The second way is darker, and I won't dwell there for long because I've spent enough time there. It's the knowledge that some disappearances are permanent for reasons that have nothing to do with choice. That remote places have a way of keeping what they take. That a young man with a rucksack and no one expecting to hear from him can simply stop existing. And the world continues turning, and the evidence is gradually absorbed into rock and soil and water. I don't know which story is true. I have sat with both of them for 8 years, and I have gotten no closer to knowing. Here's what I know about my son. I know that he was the kind of person who, at 7 years old, walked into the woods alone and found it perfectly natural. Who at 14 could identify 30 species of wild mushroom by sight? Who at 17 could navigate by stars and sleep comfortably in temperatures that would keep most people indoors? Who, when the world failed to give him a place he recognized as his own, began building a different kind of life in the spaces between, in forests, in ruins, in the vast and patient silence of nature? I know that he was not crazy. I know that he was not reckless. I know that the depression that settled over him after the military rejection was real and serious. But I also know that it sat alongside a genuine competence, a genuine capability for surviving in conditions that would defeat most people. He was not running toward death. I believe that. I have to believe that. I know that the last thing he said to me, in that kitchen, in that autumn light, was something true, that he had always felt like a foreigner, that he had never found the language for this world. I have replayed that moment thousands of times, turned it over looking for what I should have said, for the words that might have changed the course of what followed. I don't find them. I don't think they existed. I know that he loved me, not in the ways that are easy to describe, not in the effusive, demonstrative way that makes love visible and obvious, but in small, unmistakable ways. The way he always brought me something from his walks, a stone or a feather or a handful of berries. The way he came and sat near me, sometimes without saying anything, just existing in the same space. The way he looked at me, occasionally, when he didn't know I was watching, with an expression I can only describe as grateful. He knew he was loved. I believe that too. People ask me how I go on. They ask with genuine kindness, and I try to answer with genuine honesty, which is harder. The truth is that not knowing is its own kind of weight, different from grief, but not lighter than it. Grief, I've been told, is what you carry when you know. When there's a date, a cause, a grave. When you can close the chapter and begin the work of living with the loss. Not knowing is something else. It's an open window that lets in every weather. Some days the possibility that he is alive, somewhere, exploring some unnamed forest on some unnamed continent, is a source of something close to peace. Other days, it is unbearable. I keep his room as it was. Renee thinks I should change it. Maybe he's right. But I can't, not yet. The maps are still on the wall. The journals are in a box under the bed. His hiking boots are still by the door, still crusted with the mud of his last walk before he left. I have a photograph of him taken the summer before he disappeared. He's standing at the edge of a lake, not looking at the camera, looking out at the water with the particular stillness that was always his. He's tall and broad and young, and the light is that low amber evening light that makes everything look like it's about to mean something. He looks like someone who is thinking about where to go next. I've shown this photograph to so many people over the years. Police officers, investigators, witnesses, volunteers, strangers on the internet who said they recognized him or thought they might or wanted to help. I've shown it to myself every day, trying to find in it some answer that it doesn't contain. What I find instead is him. Just him, standing at the edge of the water, young and alive, and looking toward whatever was waiting for him on the other side. If Sidney is alive, and I choose every day to allow for the possibility that he is, there are things I want him to know. I want him to know that I'm not angry, that I understand, or I'm trying to, that the boy who walked into the woods at 7 years old and the young man who boarded a train to France at 19 were both trying to do the same thing, which was to find a world that fit the shape of who he was. That there is nothing shameful in that. That the world is hard and strange, and that feeling foreign in it is not a failure of character. I want him to know that he doesn't have to explain himself to me, that he doesn't have to defend his choices or account for the years or present himself a certain way. He can come back dirty and quiet and strange, the way he always was, and I will put my hand on his arm, and this time I will say more than nothing. I want him to know that his brother and sister have grown into remarkable people, people he would find interesting if he let himself, people who talk about him at every family dinner, who still look for him in crowds, who are waiting with me in their own ways. I want him to know that the reward money is still there, that it was never about finding him because we were angry or because we wanted him back against his will. It was because we were afraid, because we were still afraid, because fear is the other face of love, and I have loved him from the moment I first held him, and I will love him until I'm no longer here to love anyone. I want him to know that the woods around Garl are still there, that the forests he mapped as a teenager are still standing, still changing with the seasons, still full of sparrowhawks and limestone caves and mushrooms whose names he taught himself from books. But the lake is still there, the one in the photograph, the one where the evening light comes down amber and the water holds the sky. I want him to know he can come home. That home is wherever I am. That it has no walls and no expectations and no judgment. That it is, in the end, just a place where someone is waiting and watching the door and hoping. Sidney Lute has been missing since October 2016. He was 19 years old when he disappeared. He would be 27 today. The investigation remains open. If you have seen him or know anything about his whereabouts, please contact the Dutch National Police Missing Persons Unit or Interpol's Missing Persons Database. His name is Sidney Lute. He is 1'93", blonde hair, blue eyes, a straight nose, and no distinguishing marks. Strong, quiet, comfortable in wild places. He looks, when he is at rest, like someone who is thinking about where to go next. He is someone's son. He is my son. I have never stopped looking. I will never stop looking. Because some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Not by years, not by silence, not even by the terrible patience of not knowing. I am my son's mother. That is the one thing that does not disappear. Subscribe for more.